Hey, a Disney film. Ah, haven't seen this for years.
Go home!
Come here. Dorothy girl.
Let me state my case. The 1985 movie Return to Oz is not what you think it is. In fact, it might not even be what you think it is. It's no secret that Return to Oz is scarier than you expect it to be. But just how scary is it? Well, on the cover of my DVD re-release of 1985's Return to Oz, it reads, optimistically, "If you loved The Wizard of Oz, you'll love accompanying Dorothy on this second thrilling adventure." No, you won't. It should say, if you want to dismantle everything you thought you knew about the Technicolor world of Oz, and instead face the uncomfortable question, did any of it actually happen? Or are we looking at the hallucinatory psychiatric delusions of an adolescent girl, possibly as the result of trauma? Then you'll love accompanying Dorothy on this second thrilling adventure. Return to Oz was released kind of unbelievably, in hindsight, by Disney. It stars Fairuza Balk as Dorothy in what at first glance seems to be a kind of long-distance sequel to the original Wizard of Oz. So what's it about, generally? Well, it's 1899, and we're on the very cusp of a new electrical century.
It will be the year 1900, a new century. The 20th century. A century of electricity.
We rejoin Dorothy Gale as her adoptive uncle and auntie rebuild their Kansas farmhouse 6 months after the tornado which carried Dorothy to her first visit to Oz. Dorothy is being taken to electroconvulsive shock therapy in an attempt to treat what everyone assumes is a delusion of this magical land of Oz.
And he kept on cutting off all the other parts of his body until it was all made of tin. Even his head was...
That's all right, Dorothy.
Auntie Em believes Dorothy's imaginative stories of Oz are just that, imaginary, and therefore a problem.
Remember how we spoke?
Not to talk about Oz.
Why?
Because it's just my imagination.
During her first electrotherapy session, a lightning strike apparently causes a power outage, and Dorothy escapes the facility with the help of a mysterious blonde girl. By night, she climbs into a chicken coop, the blonde girl disappears, and Dorothy floats away from the unsettling Nurse Wilson. She wakes the next morning in Oz to find her chicken Bellina alongside her and now able to talk.
What's that?
Oh, I was just trying to lay my egg, that's all.
Bellina?
Who else?
Bellina, by the way, is voiced by the brilliant Denise Breyer. This is her in Labyrinth doing exactly the same voice.
Better to stay in here, dear. Yes, there's nothing you want out there, no. Oh, no.
The utopian Emerald City is in ruins, and its citizens, formerly full of dancing and romance and love-making, I assume, they seem like the sort, have been turned to stone. The Gnome King has conquered the city, stolen all the emeralds, and turned everything living to stone, including the Cowardly Lion and the Tin Woodsman. The Gnome King apparently rules remotely, from his massive column of rock in the middle of the deadly desert. He has kidnapped His Majesty the Scarecrow and keeps him prisoner in the form of an emerald object in his mysterious collection. The Gnome King is forcing Princess Mombi to do his bidding. Although she was already wicked, so her role in this is kind of up for debate. In fact, by the end of this thing, you might even feel a little bit of sympathy towards her.
Look. Lower.
It falls to Dorothy to rescue Scarecrow, return him to power, overthrow the Gnome King, and restore Oz and the Emerald City to its former glory. It's all a bit epic. Along the way, she accrues a colourful group of allies, including Jack Pumpkinhead, played by Brian Henson, the son of Jim Henson and the voice of Hoggle in Labyrinth. Sean Barrett as TikTok, he was also in Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, as well as my favourite character, the Gump, voiced by Lyle Conway, who was the designer of and voice for Urskex in the Dark Crystal. So a reunion for just about everyone involved. It's just missing a cameo from David Bowie's penis. But I guess that's true generally. In fact, there's so much shared genetic material between Dark Crystal, Labyrinth and Return to Oz that you can make the case they're all part of the same kind of conceptual and thematic universe, each one telling the story of an adolescent girl against a backdrop of a kind of porous reality. And I might just point out as well for completionists and fans of coincidences that the director of Dark Crystal was Frank Oz. Now naturally there are a million different threads I could pursue through this movie, but there's one in particular that I want to discuss today. The one I want to talk about today is not necessarily the only one, or the best one, and certainly not the correct one. It's just one interpretation, mine, and I submit it kind of just for consideration. Just a note though, I'm only looking at the movies The Wizard of Oz and Return to Oz, kind of in isolation. For me to make this case, I won't be looking at the rest of the literature and the canon. I know that's heresy. What I'm interested in is the Return to Oz as a kind of revisionist character study of Dorothy, and an exploration of her perception of reality. Let me explain. There are things in this movie that we can reasonably assume the movie wants us to believe are real. There is a real world, Kansas, and a magical world, Oz. In the real world, we know that Dorothy is an orphan raised in Kansas by a couple who are explicitly not her biological parents. We know for a fact that her mother is dead. We can probably assume her father is too. We know that there really was a tornado 6 months ago, and that their farmhouse really was destroyed. Since the tornado, we also know that Dorothy has been experiencing insomnia.
Hannah, it's been 6 months since the tornado, and Dorothy hasn't been herself since.
Other reviews you might read will say that Dorothy is suffering from bad dreams. That's explicitly not the case, and that's an important point. What she's experiencing is described by the Doctor as waking dreams.
This electrical marvel will make it possible for you to sleep again. And it will also get rid of all those bad waking dreams that you've been telling me about.
The Doctor clearly describes them as waking dreams, not nightmares. As far as the real world is concerned, they are hallucinations. After all, Dorothy can't sleep.
With insomnia, nothing's real. When you have insomnia, you're never really asleep, and you're never really awake.
From the outside, looking in at the things the movie wants us to believe are real, Dorothy looks like someone in need of help. From Auntie M's perspective, Dorothy is a little girl who is suffering. She is a child who lost her parents and now her home. What's more, it's implied that she was injured in the tornado.
The brain itself is an electrical machine. It's nothing but a machine. When it malfunctions, a blow to the head, for example, then the brain produces useless excess currents. And these excess currents are our dreams and delusions.
In one of the most heartbreaking shots, her adoptive parents are clearly lost. It pains them to see Dorothy suffer. They really love her. They just want to help her, but they don't know how. There is something very relatable and very humanizing about that. In the real world, it becomes hard to ignore the conclusion that Dorothy seems to be suffering some kind of post-traumatic disorder. And that's what the movie wants us to believe is real at this stage. In the Kansas clinic, that is to say, in the real world, Dorothy is visited by a mysterious blonde girl.
I have to go. I'll come back later.
It's clear that this girl is not part of the real world. She is part of the world of Oz. As far as the real world is concerned, she doesn't exist. She's eventually revealed to be Princess Ozma, the rightful ruler of Oz. Now, Ozma is the key to all of this. So who is she? Well, it's never quite made clear who Ozma is. Even at the end of the film, when she's freed from the mirror, there is still something very deliberately ethereal about her, something hallucinatory. Not to mention, Jack Pumpkinhead identifies Ozma as his mother, having already identified Dorothy as his mother earlier in the movie.
Oh. What's your name? Ozma.
I think, and stay with me here, that Ozma is Dorothy. And Dorothy is Ozma. Princess Ozma does not exist except as a kind of proxy for Dorothy's trauma. Dorothy has kind of created Ozma, kind of summoned Ozma, as a way to negotiate with and navigate through her suffering. Dorothy has separated her identity into two: the plain, poor, Kansas orphan Dorothy, and the blonde, literal Disney princess Ozma, adored and needed by a tight group of unquestionable friends in a vibrant kingdom in which she is both safe and immortal.
Anna, come and look.
What is it, darling? I'm busy.
Nothing, just a reflection.
This is a clumsy analogy, but Ozma is Tyler Durden to Dorothy's Edward Norton's character.
Why would anyone possibly confuse you with me?
I don't know.
You got it.
Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Okay, take a look at Joker, a more recent film, also dealing with the psychiatric effects of trauma. Arthur Fleck's fantasy in Joker is not a childish one about an alternative magical realm like Dorothy's, where she is needed and adored. Joker's fantasy is a very adult one, of being in a relationship in which he is adored and needed. But the principle is exactly the same. Arthur Fleck has fantasized a relationship. In Return to Oz, Dorothy has fantasized about a relationship with a magical world. Now, dissociative identity disorder. That's what's being dealt with in Joker and, to an extent, Fight Club. Dissociative identity disorder is a complex psychiatric condition, a severe form of dissociation, itself a mental process which produces a lack of connection with one's own thoughts and memories and identity. The dissociative part of this condition is thought to be a coping mechanism through which a person literally shuts off or dissociates themselves from a situation or experience that's too violent, traumatic, or painful to assimilate with their conscious self. In dissociative identity disorder, though, a person completely disconnects from the identity suffering the experience and instead creates an alternate identity, retreating into a reality free from suffering. This happens all the time, and most of us do it to some degree or another. It's common enough to have real-world examples to explain it. It's the reason why, for example, the wicked stepmother is such a prominent character in our folklore. As very young children, we don't have the emotional capacity to understand that another person is able to feel conflicting emotions at the same time. We don't yet have the ability to understand how another person can have several equal but opposite conflicting characteristics, like happiness and anger. Before we develop that theory of self, as it's known, we can't understand how people behave so differently towards us based on the situation, and therefore we all separate our mothers, for example, into two. The loving, nurturing mother on the one hand, and the wicked stepmother when she's angry. They're one and the same. And so, Dorothy and Ozma are one and the same, with Dorothy escaping into Oz when she can't process fear and pain. I mean, think about everything Dorothy has been through, even if we just take the things we assume to be real. She lost her parents as a child, her adoptive parents are dirt poor, a tornado blew their house down, and when Dorothy went to seek treatment, a lightning strike burned down the clinic and killed her doctor. Toto, you can never die. So what evidence is there within the film that it might be true? Well, come with me. I would like to show you something. Now, a little like how a dream works, a waking hallucination, however fantastical and unrealistic, will still populate itself with familiar objects and people and memories, especially things that you either frequently interact with or you have recently interacted with. Your subconscious utilizes familiar things already in your psyche to communicate with. That's why dreams and hallucinations often feel very real, very grounded. It's because the vocabulary of the hallucinations is taken from our lived experience. Our subconscious relies on our conscious experience. In the 10 minutes or so that we spend with Dorothy in the real world, we actually see her accumulating all of the visual language that her subconscious will then use in her hallucination. Everything seen in Kansas has a magical analogue in Oz. The last thing Dorothy possesses in the real world is her lunch pail, and it's the first thing that she finds in Oz.
You won't need that. Look, Melina. It's a lunch pail tree.
Ozma brings Dorothy a pumpkin in the clinic. That becomes Jack Pumpkinhead in Oz. The electrotherapy machine becomes TikTok. The stag's head becomes the Gump. Mombi is Nurse Wilson. Dr. Worley is the Gnome King.
Get rid of all those bad waking dreams that you've been telling me about.
And when you get back, you will never think of Oz again.
The orderly at the start. He's the leader of the Wheelers.
You'll be sorry for treating me like this!
I could go on. The closer you look, the more you find, and none of it is an accident. All of these subtle clues are deliberately laid out for us to highlight the porous nature of Dorothy's experience of reality, and to unsettle our sense of what is real and what is not. In fact, just my theory, I don't think anything is real after the Doctor flips the switch on the electroconvulsive shock machine. Watch this. Okay, in slow motion, you see that green flash? Again, there's no way that that could be an accident. I think that's the moment the Doctor electrocutes Dorothy and she shears her identity in two, and nothing is real after that exact moment. But I'm also kind of aware that might be a little bit too cynical, a little bit too pessimistic, so I should probably cut this bit out. Now, I would understand if you were resistant to this kind of hokey, amateur pop psychiatry that I'm doing at the moment. You're probably thinking that I'm looking too closely at this stuff and over-analysing what is just basically a magical and fantastical Disney movie. And it's really just a movie from that weird period in the 80s where everything went a bit crazy. But am I over-analysing it? What if I wasn't? So let's talk about Walter Murch for a moment. Walter Murch wrote and directed Return to Oz. You might not be familiar with his name. There's a reason. Return to Oz did not do very well. The movie bombed at the box office, got slammed by critics. It didn't even make back half of its production cost. Walter Murch never directed again. And that's kind of a shame for all of us, because Walter Murch's resume is unbelievable. Before Return to Oz, he worked on American Graffiti, The Godfather, Godfather 2, and he won an Oscar for his work on Apocalypse Now. He's still working today too, by the way. He won another Oscar for his work on The English Patient, and more recently worked on The Talented Mr. Ripley and Jarhead. This is a serious filmmaker who traffics in stories about reality and identity. But beyond all of that, what I really want to talk about is the fact that Walter Murch is the co-writer and I'm not making this up, on THX 1138. THX 1138 is George Lucas's pre-Star Wars movie, a dystopian story in which the central theme is the loss of identity and depersonalization through psychiatric medication. In Return to Oz, it's electricity. In THX 1138, it's pills. And masturbation. You have to see it. THX 1138 is a complex Orwellian story loaded with religious, philosophical and ideological iconography. There are 3 characters, for example, in THX called SRT, NCH and PTO, all references to Sartre, Nietzsche and Plato, because of their philosophical ramblings while THX is imprisoned. The point that I'm trying to make is that Walter Murch is highly literate in matters of mind, and he brought all of that to Return to Oz. So the evidence is really stacking up. Walter Murch knew what he was doing. Now don't mistake my intentions here. I'm not trying to stomp all over a beloved Disney franchise and smugly say it's all about a young girl's experience of PTSD. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, it can never be that. Even if I'm right, I think that just adds to the hope and the optimism of this film. If you follow the film as a movie, it's a very happy ending. If you follow the movie from a kind of neuropsychological view, it's an incredible ending. She gets better. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this. Return to Oz is not the movie it appears to be. It is not the movie you think it is. In fact, it's not even the movie you think it is. In fact, with hindsight, I think it's obvious that he was trying to do something very unusual, something far ahead of its time. Today, we really love these kinds of psychological reimaginings of classic icons and classic characters. Joker might be the most interesting and most lasting modern manifestation of this kind of revisionism, where we view established characters through modern and postmodern lenses. Joker is doing exactly the same thing that Return to Oz is doing, taking an iconic shared cultural figure and looking at them from a different perspective. But back in 1985, when Return to Oz was released, that had never been done before. Now, some of the criticism of Joker focused on its lack of nuance, and that a better study of psychiatric health and dissociative identity disorder might emerge from framing something other than the experience of a straight white man's, like Arthur Fleck. Well, I would argue that movie has already been made, 36 years ago, and it's Return to Oz.